Work takes up most of your time. That's why you should use Stamps.com to save time with your mailing and shipping, and have flexibility to focus on more important things. Stamps.com can handle all your mailing and shipping needs with rates up to 88% off USPS and UPS. Add flexibility to your day with Stamps.com. Go to Stamps.com/program to sign up for a special offer. No contract, cancel anytime. That's Stamps.com/program.
When we're stuck in the same routine, it can be tough to imagine New Year possibilities. But sometimes, a small change, like refreshing your dinner routine, can make a big difference in your day-to-day. Cook Unity is an easy way to reset your meal habits. Each meal is designed with you in mind, with chef-crafted dishes that bring vibrancy and health to your table. See what's possible with a simple reset. Go to cookunity.com/podcast or enter code podcast before checkout for 50% off your first week.
It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman. You can find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting if you reach out to me at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. But all the other archives are free at Spreaker.com. You go there, there's a chat room, you get an email notification. I play repeats every night of the week. We're taping this week. I'm going to do a whole day of all the people I had on the show involved with January 6th. Jake and Jilly, the QAnon shaman, and Sasha Tate, who was Stuart Rhodes' ex-husband, my guest, who was a top member of the Proud Boys, who spilled all the beans on them. I'll be doing a whole marathon of January 6th stuff on Spreaker.com. Plus, that's where we put new content up every Friday night. And if you go there to Spreaker.com or to Patreon, and you Google Walter Herbst, Herbst, like Terrible Herbst, the gas station chain in Vegas, you'll find my previous guest with Walter Herbst, who is an expert, an elder statesman on the Kennedy assassination work. We've had him on the show several times before. Let's see here. Those were the book was called It Didn't Start with JFK. It did not start with JFK, Volume 1 and Volume 2. Also, too, you can get his articles. He has a bunch of articles on there, too. I keep saying every time I talk to Walter Herbst, I want to have him come back and talk about Huey Long, because he wrote an article about Huey Long. I know, right? I'll never remember that. I'll just keep putting it on.
There's plenty of stuff.
Yeah. But Walter Herbst is a gentleman. He's a friend of the show, and he's very patient with me. I got sick this week. He was very nice about rescheduling. Walter Herbst, are you there?
I'm here, Ed.
Hey, man, thanks so much.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you, sir. And so just remind the audience, though, who is Walter Herbst?
Walter Herbst is a historian of the JFK assassination and 20th century history, the Cold War, and how various different things come together, and various groups came together and eventually resulted in the assassination of JFK.
Now, you have another one coming up, too, right? It's going to be coming out in April called Last Resort, Beyond the Last Resort, the JFK Assassination, the Need to Protect West Berlin, and Why a Second Invasion of Cuba Never Happened. Now,
correct.
And it's a unique theory about the motive for the JFK assassination.
Yeah, it is. I mean, the Berlin gets very little attention as far as the JFK assassination is concerned. But it is very important in that everything JFK did during his presidency, and you can even say the same about Khrushchev from his perspective, was what would happen to Berlin if we did this. If we went into Laos or if we went into Vietnam, what would happen? If we attacked Cuba, what would happen to Berlin? Because Berlin was the gateway to Western Europe, and that was a major concern. And so Berlin... I take that angle and I delve deeply into it and look at the second part is why a second invasion of Cuba never happened, and that's why. I mean, they were looking, the Kennedy brothers were looking to invade Cuba. They were thinking about it, but they couldn't do it because they knew they had to come up with a way to invade Cuba and not affect West Berlin. But they couldn't do it. And to be honest with you, and what my book's going to be about, I don't want to reveal too much, but that let's just say it's possible that JFK was assassinated actually to prevent the second invasion of Cuba from happening.
No, that's bad. But once again, though, could he trust that same bunch? That same bunch of the anti-Castro Cubans and the Watergate burglars are all involved in the first invasion. Could he trust them? Go back to them again?
Well, that's the thing. Okay, He had his AmWorld group that he was looking at, which were basically left-wing leaning Cuban exiles led by Harry Williams, and Robert Kennedy was running the operation. But simultaneous to that, we had Paulino Sierra, who was putting together a group of Cuban exiles, businessmen who were financing him, and members of the mafia who were financing him. And these were right-wing Cuban exiles who could have pulled it off without the assistance of the Kennedy brothers. And there was talk of December 1963 of an invasion of Cuba happening. And you have a lot of chatter of Cuban exiles saying, we're going to, as soon as we take care of Kennedy, we're going to invade Cuba. But it's possible that someone circumvented this whole operation and eliminated Kennedy to prevent that Cuban invasion from happening. And I always ask myself, and I ask myself in the book, and that's what I ask readers to look at, is why didn't we invade Cuba after Kennedy was assassinated? I mean, we had Lee Harvey Oswald, a Russian defector, Fair Play for Cuba Committee member, went to Mexico City, tried to get into Cuba, left a letter saying that he had used a false, an alias in Mexico City. And anyway, there's plenty of reasons to look at. There were plenty of reasons for the United States to invade Cuba based on just who Oswald was, and we just ignored it. And so, I mean, to me, that's the key to the whole story. Why did we not invade Cuba after Oswald was accused of killing Kennedy?
Yeah, it's such a fascinating time in our history. So people keep your eye out for this book. It'll be coming out in April. Last Resort, Beyond Last Resort, the JFK Assassination, The Need to Protect West Berlin, and Why a Second Invasion of Cuba Never Happened by Walter Herbst. And you can go there right now. There's a pre-order savings, pre-order price guarantee that you can go there and check out. Okay, but the reason why we had you back on the show, because you wrote this incredible post on Facebook. Oh, boy.
Yeah.
I guess about the motivation, like who was behind ordering Ruby to kill Oswald. Does that sum it up?
Pretty much. Okay,
Yeah.
Where basically that the official story is that Jack Ruby was compelled to kill Lee Harvey Oswald because he didn't want Jackie Kennedy to come back to Dallas to testify in a trial. And this is Jack Ruby, who would pistol whip people into submission. Even he said something when he was interviewed by the Warren Commission when Merle Warren and Gerald Ford came down, and he kind of sarcastically said, "That's the greatest story I ever told. That I did something basically out of the goodness of my heart to prevent Jackie from coming down here." I mean, it's nonsense. But regardless, that's the official story. But the real story tells something else.
Well, what does it tell? What is the effect? What did you come up with?
Okay, well, I think there's a number of layers to it, but I focus mostly, and that's what we'll talk about today, I think, is that at the time of the assassination, David Ferry, who was a right-wing anti-communist zealot, who was working for Carlos Marcello, the crime boss of New Orleans. He was in a courtroom with Carlos Marcello because he was on trial for perjury and he was getting acquitted. And Ferry was connected to Guy Bannister, 54 Camp Street, what was called the Cuban Grand Central Station. And he was close to Oswald, Lee Harvey Oswald. He was part in the 1950s. Oswald was part of the Civil Air Patrol, and Ferry was an instructor in New Orleans, and there's a photograph showing the two of them in together. And he also, when he came back after he had defected, came back in the early in 1963, that he and Ferry worked together, and we have numerous eyewitness testimony, credible people saying that was the case. Okay, well, on the night that JFK was assassinated, David Ferry and two young male companions drove about 360 miles to Houston in a violent rainstorm. And the reason they did that was because one of those two companions and one was a roller skater who had never ice skated, and he wanted to ice skate. And according to their story, is that the ice skating rink in the New Orleans area was closed because of the assassination. But I guess they knew the one in Houston was open, so they decided to drive all the way to Houston and to go ice skating. In 1963, it wasn't an easy trip. Like I said, 360 miles. So they made it there. They arrived at the Altamont Hotel in Houston at 4 a.m, and on Saturday they went to the Winterland skating rink. Now, those two companions skated. Ferry did not, and the manager rink recalls that he never went ice skating. He just hung around the payphone, making and receiving calls. Now, Ferry approached the manager, and they talked, and because he said he was interested in buying an ice skating rink such as the one the guy had, but it was more. It seems to be more that was just to give a justification for why we were there.
Yeah, especially since if the nearby ice skating rink was closed because of the Kennedy assassination, and they don't get to the other one until the next day, the first one probably would have been open by then, right?
Well, that's the point, right? I mean, but these people are very clever as far as giving explanations that at least those in authority who want to believe that story, they have to give them something. So anyway, that's been the official story. Okay, and while he was there, he made a collect call to Carlos Marcello's Town and Country Motel in New Orleans. And like I said, Carlos was the mafia boss in New Orleans who had in September 1962 put a hit out on John Kennedy. He, Santos Traficante, and Jimmy Hoffa did it all in September 1962. But fine, so Ferry left Houston that evening and drove to Galveston, Texas. He checked into a hotel around 10 p.m., then he went out into the morning, early hours. Now, but he's in Galveston. Now, meanwhile, while this is going on, a friend of Jack Ruby's named Breck Wall left Dallas and made an equally suspicious trip to Galveston. Now, Breck Wall worked at the Adolphus Hotel across the street from Jack Ruby's Carousel Club in Dallas. Now, and he managed or ran some kind of a burlesque type review called Bottoms Up. Okay, so now in front of the Warren Commission, Breck Wall said that he and his partner, his name was Peterson, they stood in front of the Adolphus Hotel marquee and watched JFK pass. He said he was going 30 miles per hour, not 10 miles per hour. They couldn't get a good look. So they decided to rush to Love Field, which is the airfield where JFK landed. That was their plan. To see JFK when he returned there, because he had heard JFK hung around Love Field, and he figured they could get a good sight of him. You know, I've walked that area a number of times, and the problem I seem to have is unless something has changed, that the Adolphus was on Commerce Street, not on Main Street where the car was coming down. Okay, there was a block away, parallel to Main Street, facing the opposite direction. So how could he see JFK a block away from Main Street, and which he says he did, but he didn't get a good look, so they left. Okay, maybe it's true. I'm not going to say it wasn't. But years later, this Breck Wall said that they were at the Adolphus, and being a fan of the Kennedys, that he and his friend Joe Peterson, his business partner, they climbed onto the second floor marquee and sat watching the motorcade pass by on the street below. And he said, when the open Lincoln, the limo, passed beneath us, he saw Jackie pat the president on the knee, and they pointed up at me, and JFK waved at them. So it would seem to me that would satisfy most people, but he previously told the Warren Commission that he didn't get a good look at the president, and later on he said the president waved at him. So, I'm not saying anything's really out of the ordinary here, but just something doesn't add up. And it's, again, it looks like it's just a story that Breck Wall made up justifying why he made the trip to Galveston.
And how did the story of Breck Wall get to the Warren Commission? How did he become? I've never heard the name before. How did he become a significant name to be interviewed by the Warren Commission?
The Breck Wall, after the fact and returned. I mean, I don't know 100% how it became known that he went there, but I think between Ralph Paul, who we'll get to, and Jack Ruby, and Breck Wall, it was an associate of both of them. It became public knowledge that he had gone to Galveston. And then what made Galveston important was because while David Ferry is going to Galveston himself with his two associates, a fellow named Jack Martin, who worked for Guy Bannister back in New Orleans, the night of the assassination, gets pistol whipped by Bannister.
Right.
And Martin then tells authorities that David Ferry may have had something to do with the assassination. He may have flown people. His job may have been, he was a pilot, to fly people out of Dallas. So by the time Ferry gets the word that from New Orleans that they're looking to talk to you, and so when he comes back, he reaches out, or I don't know if he approaches Jim Garrison or the FBI. But it's interesting because one of the guys he was with, Alvin Bioboff, who accompanied Ferry on his trip to Houston and Galveston. When he was questioned by the FBI on November 25th, he refused to talk without Carlos Marcello's attorney, G. Ray Gill, being present. And later that day, when Bioboff and Ferry's roommate, Leighton Martins, were arrested, they refused to discuss anything without the assistance of another Marcello attorney, Jack Wasserman. And Ferry, who claimed to be totally innocent, appeared for questioning with Gill at his side. So, and then maybe that was prudent on their part, but people very quickly, who were in New Orleans, and there was no direct association between them and the JFK assassination, all of a sudden lawyered up and wanted to protect themselves. Right, so it's justifiable, I suppose, but what happens is after you put some of these stories together, and with coincidence and justifiable things or questionable things, there comes a point where you look at all in its totality and you say to yourself, is it really feasible that all of this is just a coincidence? Or is there something here? I mean, in my opinion, there's something here.
It also seems kind of sloppy, too, right?
Well, it must have been spur of the moment. I think what motivated Ferry to go and Breck Wall, I think what happened is Ruby was told to kill Oswald. And Oswald had a connection to New Orleans, right? He was there the whole summer. And even prior to that, handing out leaflets, which is the Guy Bannister standby, right? They handed out leaflets saying "Fair Play for Cuba Committee, pro-communist" or whatever, and also working. There's evidence that he did have a connection to Carlos Marcello, and so it's sloppy, but I can see if Marcello thought he was being set up as a patsy in the assassination, because with Oswald's arrest, and I think the FBI played a role, but not a major role. It was a backup minor role. But regardless, with the arrest of Oswald, it pointed to New Orleans, and they had to nip it in the bud. I think Ruby was instructed to kill Oswald, and his only way out was to send Breck Wall down and talk to, and Ferry was sent by Marcello, and hopefully, plead his case to why it wasn't necessary to kill him. And of course, that didn't happen for him. And in doing it in such a way, I mean, the idea was to use cutouts, right? It was pretty typical. You wouldn't go direct. You wouldn't make a phone call. You would have other people do it for you, so that there would be a separation, so that if anyone tried to make a trace, you couldn't just directly connect Ruby to what was going on in New Orleans. But Ruby had connections to New Orleans.
And it also seems, too, from your article here on Facebook, and if you go to Walter Herbst on Facebook, is that when Ruby was given the order, he didn't even own a gun. He didn't have a gun handy to go do this hit. One of the biggest hits in history. Right.
So I mean, Jack Ruby, I mean, it's an interesting character because he may, and there was other stuff going on at the time too, not just the assassination. There were gun deals going on, and there was a type of gun deal that went bad that may have involved 2 days before that may have involved Oswald and Ruby, and there were people who fingered them. I mean, there's no direct evidence that they were involved, but Jack Ruby was a gun runner with Thomas Eli Davis. He admitted that. Right, and Thomas Eli Davis had connections to the CIA, and he wound up being arrested in Morocco the day after the assassination because he had a letter describing the assassination and mentioning the name Oswald. Well, in his case, it turned out to be Victor Oswald, a gun runner in Spain. But regardless, I mean, like I say, the coincidence start to pile up. Sooner or later, you have to look at them and say, this can't be a coincidence. It's too. Yeah. The odds on it against it are too great. But anyway, so we've got Ferry heading towards Galveston, and we've got Breck Wall heading towards Galveston. And back in Dallas, Jack Ruby is nervous as can be. And at 10:44 p.m., a call goes from his sister's apartment to a restaurant called The Bullpen, which was owned by Ruby's good friend Ralph Paul. Paul later said he was gone from the restaurant at the time, never took the call, but a waitress says, no, that's not true. He was there, and she recalled Paul saying, are you crazy? A gun. And again, it's just, who knows? You got to assume that Ruby and Paul talking about that's connected to this trip to Galveston.
Yeah.
So at 11 o'clock, Ruby starts calling. He's at the Carousel Club, and he starts calling Galveston, trying to talk to Wall. He finds he hasn't arrived. They knew that Wall was going. He had friends in Galveston that he would visit on occasion, so he had a reason for going there. And so they knew what number to call him at. So Ruby calls Ralph Paul again, and they talked for a while. And then a half hour later, he called Paul again. And then 20 minutes before midnight, he finally reached Wall in Galveston, and whatever was so important took 2 minutes to talk, to discuss. And after hanging up, he waited just a brief moment, and then he called Paul for the fourth time in approximately an hour and a half. They spoke briefly, and there was nothing really left to say.
I don't know, Walter, how do you know about these phone calls? I can understand the long-distance calls.
They have phone records. They have the phone records.
I can understand the long-distance calls, but back in those days, local usage calls, you had to put in an order in advance. You had to order that before those records would be available. Like, not everybody had records of local usage for a local number, for a local phone call.
Right. I can't give you the exact answer for how they have it, but it's pretty much for the longest time it's been a matter of record.
Yeah.
I'm assuming that when the Warren Commission got a hold of this story, that they probably investigated it deeply and had the resources to figure out these calls.
Okay.
Now, here's some things that we know about the Jack Ruby's Carousel Club that wasn't known at the time. One is that Carlos Marcello and his organization controlled the Carousel Club. It wasn't Ruby. He was only the club's manager. Ruby had a string of failed clubs before the Carousel for decades. And he had one investor. That was his good friend Ralph Paul, who was trying to call that night. And he kept lending Ruby large sums of money for money-losing ventures. Now, in the 70s, the House Select Committee on Assassinations found that Ralph Paul repeatedly loaned Ruby money, eventually totaling $15,000, which was a large sum for them, plus an additional sum of money, which was about $15,000 to $17,000. assist Ruby to pay his taxes. I mean, Ruby didn't have any money. Okay, now Ralph Paul was the owner of a relatively small restaurant in Dallas, the Bullpen Drive-In. And he couldn't come up with his money on his own. So one of Marcello, I mean, it just doesn't make any sense, right? I mean, if they're working on if Ruby's involved in the assassination at this time or something's going on, he doesn't have the money yet, right? But one of Marcello's underbosses in Dallas, say Joe Campisi, the thought is he was funneling money to Paul to launder the funds for the carousel. And Campisi said in an FBI interview that Ralph Paul was his partner. Okay, now, according to an FBI report, about Ruby, Marcello says he met him in Dallas, and he set him up in the bar business there, and that Ruby was what he called, say, a homosexual son of a bitch is what he called it, but so something to that effect. But good. But he thought he was good to have around because he knew what was happening in town, especially with the police department. Right? I mean, Ruby knew the police well, treated them well at the Carousel Club, and basically, which is how on the day, the weekend of the assassination, he got to go basically wherever he wanted in the police department without anyone stopping him. And and Marcello, he just said the police were on the tape, and with that that's kind of known. Was that Ruby would also come to New Orleans to Churchill Farms, which was Marcello's big estate, and just keep him posted what was happening all the time. Now, sidebar to all of this is that J.D. Tippett, the police officer, was shot and killed in the afternoon after JFK was killed, worked security on weekends at Ralph Paul's Austin Barbecue. Okay, and he also did the exact same thing at Stevens Park Theater Cinema on Sundays. And Austin Cook was a member of the Birch Society and knew Ralph Paul well. One of Paul's restaurants was the Miramar, located near this theater. The manager of the theater was a man named Manuel Avila, who was a CBS correspondent to Mexico, and also ran a nightclub and worked as an interpreter for anti-Castro activists. I mean, pieces come together with this story. I mean, you can't, there's no smoking gun that you can say, okay, here we connect them. But, like I said, you look at all the circumstantial evidence, and where there's smoke, there's fire. This guy, Avila, maintained contact with groups, right-wing Cuban exile groups like the DRE and Alpha 66, who at that time were gravitating toward Paulino Sierra's anti-Castro group. Okay, and so, I mean, there's these pieces come together, right? And so, but now even more crazy that the FBI and the Warren Commission were trying to track down the money, as they always do. And we knew Ralph Paul owned 50% of the Carousel Club, but no one could find out who owned the other 50%. And after Ruby killed Oswald, Ralph Paul simply gave up his 50% ownership and walked away and left it. Now, but we also know now in the 1980s, Carlos Marcello was imprisoned, and he was, I think it was syphilis that he had, but he was, he's dying, and so some people don't put much stock in what he had to say. But I think it's important, right? Now, this guy Van Landingham was also in prison with Marcello, and he approached the FBI, and they put a radio in their cell with a transmitter. They could record what was being said, and so Van Landingham knew what to ask. And Marcello told him that they controlled the Carousel Club. And he said one of his underbosses in Dallas, which most likely be Joe Campisi, funneled money to Ralph Paul to launder the funds for the carousel. And the House Select Committee on Assassination investigated. They were confused when Campisi said in an FBI interview that Ralph Paul was his partner. Campisi's Egyptian restaurant, which is still, everyone makes a pilgrimage there when you go to Dallas, was large and popular, and Campisi was a powerful mobster. So he didn't need Ralph Paul as a partner. Mm-hmm. But it makes perfect sense if you think that they're using Ralph Paul to launder money, which is probably what was happening.
Let me ask you this. You mentioned a couple of times the John Birch Society, right?
Yeah.
Now, I had Dr. Caulfield on the show, right? Jeffrey Caulfield.
Yep.
General Walker on the murder of President Kennedy, extensive new evidence of radical right-wing conspiracy. And he said that Ruby had Birch Society material in his trunk.
Right.
And what do you think of that?
It's almost like Ruby left a roadmap to kind of, when people would look in his trunk to say, maybe this is who was forcing Ruby to do what he had to do. I mean, Jack Ruby was the last person who would be associated with the John Birch Society directly.
Really?
Well, first of all, he was Jewish, and he was very, very, very sensitive about how Jewish people were being treated. And certainly the John Birch Society, the Minutemen, and all these right-wing Dallas groups were very anti-Semitic, very racist, and very anti-communist. So that doesn't mean that Ruby didn't have a connection in some capacity. I mean, there was gun running to be done and ways to make money, and Ruby was not averse to that. But the fact that he left, and I think he also left some Excellence had a radio broadcast. I can't remember the name of it now. But again, it was very, very right-wing, and he had a copy, at least one or two copies of a Hunt broadcast in his car when he was arrested. When he was arrested.
When Ruby was arrested.
When Ruby was arrested, correct.
Well, and another thing, too, it always fascinates me, too. I remember talking to Dr. Corfield about this, too, because even General Walker got arrested in a men's room. having a homosexual encounter. It was just, there's a thread of homosexuality through all of this, right?
There seems to be. I don't think there's any connection between that fact and any of these deaths. But there's a hypocrisy, you could say, because I'm sure before he was outed, Walker would have given the death penalty to anyone who was caught in a bathroom looking for involved in any homosexual activity. But and Ruby, there's rumors about Ruby being gay, and maybe it's true, maybe it wasn't, or at least bisexual. And also with Oswald. Oswald in New Orleans was seen frequently with a bunch of gay Cubans, and went to that lawyer, Dean Andrews. He says Oswald showed up with looking to get legal advice for these Cuban exiles that are coming to the country. So, I don't know if there's anything that we can make about a gay connection.
I don't think it's the center of it, but there is a weird thread through all this,
There is, and Walker was a strange guy, very strange guy. And,
who was?
General Walker.
Oh, yeah, Walker. Yeah, Walker was a strange guy, yeah. Well, what do you make of that whole theory that Walker, the attempted assassination was like a hoax or something?
That argument, the assassination depended on him?
Yeah, on Walker, the shot through the window that they tied back to Oswald.
I think I agree. I mean, even Walker, years later, when they showed the bullet, allegedly the bullet that was fired, that was to develop the story a little. So Walker is sitting at his desk doing his income tax, and Lee Harvey Oswald allegedly, but there are other people involved. I think he was there. Maybe he fired a shot. Maybe he didn't. But there are other people there with him, according to an eyewitness, and shot through a closed window at Walker, and Walker just happened to lean forward, and the bullet missed him and went into the wall behind him. And the bullet that they showed was more like the Manlinchia-Carcano bullet that Oswald's gun would have used, and Walker said no, that was nowhere near it, that it was a tiny little thing, and but it would see if Oswald were being watched, or just to see how he would handle this, would he go through with it? It wasn't so much killing Walker, it was just that he would make the attempt. And I think that possibly may be what it is. And it's very interesting when you read, he left his wife, Marina Oswald, did a letter, like 10 points in it, as if he was never coming back. And this is prior to the shooting, and it was like, we have friends here, You can get you go to the post office. It's at this. You know where it is. It's at this location. But he made a couple of interesting statements, and like he said, "Burn my clothes. I don't care about that." But like his military papers, he wanted to keep, which was out of line with a man who left the Marines with a dishonorable discharge and defected to the Soviet Union. But more importantly, what always struck me about that note that Oswald left was that he said to Marina, "If I'm alive and taken prisoner," and I forget the rest of it, but the important. I mean, if most people under the circumstances would say, "If I'm arrested," right? I mean, say if I'm alive and taken prisoner, it's like you're going behind enemy lines as a spy, and that doesn't mean that. Maybe those were the words Oswald chose. I just thought they were very curious words for if he was going out on his own just to shoot at Walker. Say if I'm alive and taken prisoner, it was a curious choice of words, considering everything else we know about Oswald.
Yeah, I never heard that before. That's very interesting, too. Now, when we were talking off there, you were talking about, once again, with the anti-Semitism and Jack Ruby, that when we were talking about when he was in custody, he gave this long speech about, I think he was even saying that there were basements or underground tunnels underneath the prison with Nazis down there. I think am I crazy about that or what?
I don't know that part.
Okay,
but I mean, look, Ruby, just look at Ruby for a second. I mean, he was really bothered. Okay, when he went up on the day of assassination, he went to the second floor of the Dallas Morning News, and he was going to just pay for the ads that he was going to run, allegedly not knowing that JFK was about to die. And he saw a "Welcome, Mr. Kennedy" ad by the American Fact-Finding Committee, and the name associated with Bernard Weissman. And this was a list of grievances against Kennedy. And it upset him very, very much that this fellow Weissman was associated with it. Now, the big thing with Ruby, though, was when Chief Justice Earl Warren, head of the Warren Commission, came to Dallas to talk to him. And Gerald Ford was there as well. And Jack Ruby said to him things like, to Earl Warren, now, you've been here 5 or 6 months ago. A certain organization wouldn't have completely formed now so powerfully to use me because I'm of the Jewish extraction. And people have looked at him as, as kind of a overreaction by some nut, but it's not really true. I mean, you had very right-wing groups and that were really anti-Semitic. And I'm also working on a side project with Leslie Sharp, who, as you know, worked with Hank Albarelli, who's passed, died unfortunately too young, but they wrote Coup in Dallas, which is a great book that has the Lafitte date book in it that basically covers a international conspiracy to kill JFK with basically it's a fascist organization that would want him dead, and so when you consider that, and I'm really interested in that, and I believe in that Lafitte date book, and so when you start taking some of the stuff Ruby said in the context of a fascist group trying to kill JFK, it makes some sense, and Ruby said a whole new form of government is taking over our country because the Jewish people are being exterminated, which is a little ridiculous. They're not being exterminated, but still. I think Ruby was referring to some right-wing extremist groups that he was associated with, and maybe they were the ones that put him up to killing Oswald. And it's possible that he thought he was hoping that Carlos Marcello would intervene and stop that from happening. And he had Brick Wall go to Galveston to meet David Ferrier and was hoping to get a positive reaction, but he didn't get it. So, I mean, his fate was basically sealed.
People can go back in the archives. I've interviewed both Hank Albarelli about his first book, and I begged him to come on to talk about the next book. It seemed like he was working on it forever, but I did manage to get Leslie Sharp to come on and talk about the second book too. By the way, which I have 2 copies of. The publisher mailed me 2. I was trying to get this book, this interview for so long. They sent me 2 copies, but then unfortunately he passed away. Right, just about right at the same time as the book was published, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think Leslie and I we would gladly come on together and talk to you about it.
Oh yeah, we could do another show about that. Sure, that would be great. Yeah, about the Hank Alberelli book. What's it called? Coup d'etat, something like that. Coup in Dallas, right?
Well, I don't. It's there's no. We have, the Coup in Dallas was the book that Hank and Leslie wrote.
Right.
Right. Correct. And so I mean, it's very interesting. Ruby's reaction. That after the assassination, he was on the second floor, like I said, of Dallas Morning News, and people who saw him just said he was basically shaking, ashen color, and he told somebody, I'm going to have to leave. I'm leaving Dallas, and he went to his sister's house and brought about enough food for a week. And then just went into the bathroom and threw up. And around 1:40 in the afternoon, he returned to the Carousel Club. He telephoned his good friend Ralph Paul. It was always the guy he relied on. Okay, and then there was a guy, he called this guy Alex Gruber in Los Angeles also, who had been to Dallas to see him. And according to Gruber, they have to end the conversation because Ruby broke down and started basically crying. But 2 minutes later, after hanging up, he called Ralph Paul again. I mean, there's stuff going on, that he seems like an emotional wreck at this point, but then something changed. Okay, if you remember the night of the assassination, they had an impromptu press conference in the basement of the police department, where Oswald was paraded out, and Ruby was sitting in the back room. And District Attorney Henry Wade, who at that time thought there was a conspiracy to kill JFK and that more than one person was involved until Lyndon Johnson's henchman called Dallas and said, you better stop saying that. But anyway, he said that by this point, Oswald had been taken away, and he said that Lee Harvey Oswald belonged to the Free Cuba Committee. Now, the Free Cuba Committee was an anti-Castro group, which was the opposite of Oswald. And no one in that hall knew the significance of that, except for one person, Jack Ruby, who had managed to sneak his way in there. And he stands up and says, he corrects Wade, and he says, no, it wasn't the Free Cuba Committee. Oswald belonged to the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. The only person in that room who knew the significance of these groups and that it was important to connect Oswald to the Fair Play for Cuba Committee was Jack Ruby.
You'd think some of these other reporters, or maybe some ambitious cop, would turn to him and say, well, how do you know this, Mr. Ruby? You're a nightclub owner.
You would think. You would think, God. Right. But that's the point, isn't it?
Yeah.
He's not even a nightclub owner. He's a strip joint owner. He's in the middle of Dallas. This happens. No one's expecting it. Oswald supposedly did it alone. And somehow, Jack Ruby, or at least after the fact, that somebody didn't come to him and say, how did you know that? Yeah. But he did. Now, after that press conference, though, there was a notable change in Ruby. Now, Seth Cantor wrote a good book about Ruby in the late 60s, early 70s. He was a reporter there. In fact, he met Ruby, or he not met him for the first time, but came across Ruby at Parkland Hospital. And he said he met Ruby there. And the Warren Commission said he was wrong, mistaken, but he wasn't mistaken. He knew Ruby well. And but his report about when he met Ruby after that press conference was that he was no longer grim, crying, or a beaten man like he appeared earlier. Now he was animated. He said he's walking around shaking hands with people, out of town reporters, handing them cards to go to the Carousel Club and what have you. So what happened? For some reason, after that, Ruby thought there was a reason he might survive that weekend. And the only thing I could think of is that he knew Oswald, and Oswald obviously had not fingered him. And Oswald not right. So I mean, maybe, but he had one hurdle to get over, and that was to just this assassination attempt that he had to.
You know what always struck me about the Dallas police station and the actual shooting? I apologize, I don't know his name, but that big cop in that big white tan suit with that big white hat. Okay. Right. Everyone else is wearing black suits. There's one guy wearing his white outfit, you know.
I know what you mean.
Yeah, I remember his name either, but. And when he's holding up Oswald, and when the shooting stops, he doesn't duck for cover or jump for the gun. He's still holding him up.
They should have given Oswald a shirt with a big bullseye on it. Right? They might as well have done that because, and the other guy is Captain
Put him
Fritz.
in a barrel in a duck suit, you know?
Exactly. Right. So Captain Fritz is ahead of Oswald and the two officers who are handcuffed to him. And it's almost like he's just walking along and waiting to hear the gunshot.
Yep.
Thing. And I'm convinced, because people will say, well, how could there's no way Ruby did it, that it was planned. It was spontaneous because he went to a Western Union office and he had promised to send money to one of his strippers, which he did. And then then Oswald was brought down late. And how is it possible that Ruby could have timed it in such a way it'd be coincidence? Well, not unless they held Oswald until Ruby was in place.
Yeah, and as you just said, if Ruby left the first time in such a good mood, maybe because he made that deal, you know, or they tipped him off saying we're going to parade him by you.
That's the thing, and he really thought he was going to plead insanity or something and just get off. That he'd be treated like a hero. And they brought Melvin Belli in from California, and Ruby didn't belong to the mob, but all he did was talk to the mob and use a mob lawyer and everything else. But somehow he was just this innocent nightclub owner as they portrayed him to be.
Wait, real quick. What was I going to say? So all of Ruby's connections were to organized crime. Did he have any kind of connections to CIA or any kind of intelligence or anything?
Not the CIA, not that we know of. But the one interesting thing was in 1959, Castro had taken over in Cuba, and Louis McWillie was an associate of Ruby's, and he was in Cuba. He was working at the casinos, and he called Ruby to come to Havana because Santo Traficante, the Tampa mob boss who was running the casinos, was incarcerated there, and he needed to get Ruby to help get him out, try and get him out of prison. Well, before he left, he talked to the FBI, Ruby did, and he then went out and he got himself a wire that he could put on his body, to try and tape record conversations and things of that nature, like a whole spy paraphernalia. And he met with the FBI on a number of occasions. And then the FBI called it off saying that he didn't bring anything of value. Well, people have speculated if he met so many times with the FBI that they wouldn't have done that unless he gave them something. But anyway, there was something with the FBI that he had a connection with. And then there are reports that during the 1950s, during the McClellan Committee and the Kefauver Committee investigating organized crime, that Jack Ruby was an informant for George Hunter White and Jean-Pierre Lafitte of the infamous Lafitte date book. Okay, so that, and they were looking for, and that they were looking for a person named Jack LaRue. And Jack LaRue was Jack Ruby, and they could never find him. Not Lafitte and George Hunter White, but George Hunter White and Lafitte, they were CIA connected guys, and they were at the time involved actually working with the CIA and the mafia, experimenting on drugs, part of MK Ultra, and having safe houses where they would lure people there. And so Ruby having a connection to them is very interesting. And but the other interesting thing is, getting back to the date book again, McWilly's name is in the date book, Ruby's name is in the date book, Thomas Eli Davis's name is in the date book, George Hunter White's name is in the date book, of course Lafitte's is, and a fellow named John Wilson Hudson. Now, Wilson Hudson's an interesting character because of a connection to Mexico City and Lee Harvey Oswald. Okay, but on November 26, 1963, or 4 days after the assassination, the American embassy in London was contacted by John Wilson Hudson to tell them that while he was in Cuba in the summer of '59, that he came across an American gangster type named Ruby, and that Santo Traficante was visited by Ruby. Now, Hudson was incarcerated himself, but the point is, that's 4 years later, he still remembered Ruby and took the time to call the embassy and mention Ruby. That's not the only time something like that happened. Now, William Godet was a CIA asset in New Orleans, and he was basically hovered around the anti-Castro Cuban exile community, Guy Bannister, David Ferrie, what have you. And years after the assassination, author Anthony Summers interviewed Godet, and Godet told him that Oswald was with Bannister, Oswald was with Sergio Arcacha Smith, who was a part of the Cuban Revolutionary Council, and but that he worked with David Ferrie, and that when Oswald went to Mexico City, he had to get a visa, and the list of people who were getting visas were all included in the War Commission report except for one, and it was inadvertently left out years later. It was disclosed that the man standing directly in front of Lee Harvey Oswald was William Godet. Again, another coincidence. Okay, now
wait. When they were applying for visas, they were applying for visas together. City. Oh my God!
Well, according to them, it was just coincidence that one was behind the other.
Yeah.
Okay, so now, in again, November 27, 1963, 5 days after the assassination, Godet comes out and he contacts the New Orleans FBI to tell them that Jack Ruby had purchased paintings from a man named Lorenzo Borenstein in 1959 in the summer, while Ruby was stopping off and going back and forth from his trips to Havana to try and get Traficante out of jail. All right, so now again, Godet's focus, center of gravity, is the anti-Castro Cuban exile community, David Ferrie, Guy Bannister, Sergio Arcacha Smith, what have you. So that's what he's looking at. He's not staking out some painter, some place where you can buy paintings, and sees a guy, and then says 4 years later, remembers, oh, he looks like the guy that I saw. That must be Jack Ruby. No. So, I mean, it's pretty obvious that Jack Ruby was involved with these people going back to 1959. And then fast forward to 1963, and then there's a Ferrie-Ruby connection through this Galveston encounter. And so it's not illogical, right, that David Ferrie would be the one asked to go meet up with Breck Wall to pass word along to David Ferrie. And then you have also Thomas Eli Davis, who was a gun runner. And when Ruby was arrested after killing Oswald, his lawyer asked him, is there any one person or any person that could be harmful to you? And he mentioned Thomas Eli Davis. Yeah, they ran guns together, and he said now they're going to find out about the guns. They're going to find out about Cuba, about New Orleans, about everything. And in August 1963, we don't know if it's Thomas Eli Davis, but a T.E. Davis checked in for 2 nights at the LaSalle Hotel in New Orleans. Okay, so I mean, it most likely was Thomas Eli Davis. So there is a connection between all of these people, and perhaps some of them, got caught up in a situation where they were getting set up, or at least they thought they were getting set up as a patsy for the assassination, just like Oswald was, because of an association to him. Or they were involved with the assassination themselves. It's possible too, but I kind of think they were. Or at least Ruby was. I don't know about Davis or Hudson, but I mean, where people had roles involving Oswald that then, guilt by association, once Oswald was arrested, placed themselves in harm's way.
Walter Herbst, incredible stuff as usual. That's like the last 2 times you've been on, man. I tell you, bro. And some of this is going to be in the next book, Last Resort, Beyond Last Resort, the JFK assassination that needs to protect West Berlin, and some of this, right?
Right, it is. And the book is, in addition to what we discussed before as far as Berlin and not invading Cuba, it's a narrative about the Kennedy assassination, the hatred that was built up by him, the pressures that John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy faced, with trying to make with the military basically being very dissatisfied with them, and also what Ruby was doing and Oswald were doing completely during that whole Kennedy presidency. And it's a fascinating story, and it's caught my attention for many, many years. And I think people will like the book.
It's a very cool cover art too, as well, which you can go on, even though it's not available yet. You can go on Amazon right now and check out the cover of the book, and lock in your prices, because you know, with those Trump tariffs, the price of everything's going to be going up. The price of paper and book printing and ink will be going up 25%. So lock in your prices now. Walter Herbst, thank you so much, man. You're such a friend to be so patient with me. I got sick this week and you rescheduled. Usually it's technical issues, but this time it's physical.
Ed, I've appreciated all you've done, and I'm always here for you when you need me.
Thank you, sir. Herbstbooks.com is where you can get the books as well. Okay, and I know you had a rough week. You had a rough couple of months yourself, man. So thank you so much for being there. So good to me with this.
You're welcome, Ed.
You got it, my friend. Good night.
Good talking to you. Okay, bye-bye.